What happens when the most powerful person you can imagine loses absolutely everything, including control over their own body? Not metaphorically, not philosophically, but literally watching themselves dissolve day by day, while their mind still recognizes exactly what's happening. This isn't about Napoleon Bonaparte the Conqueror. Every documentary covers that. This is about something far more uncomfortable. This is about what terminal illness reveals about the fundamental fragility of human identity, and why understanding this matters for every single person listening right now. Because here's what nobody talks about. The psychology of physical collapse follows patterns so predictable, so universal, that understanding what happened in that isolated room on Saint Helena in 1821 can actually prepare you for conversations you'll inevitably have with people you love. By the end of this, you'll understand not just what killed Napoleon, but what his death teaches us about how we cope when our bodies betray us. The medical reality of Napoleon's final months serves as perhaps the most documented case study in the psychology of terminal illness from the 19th century. What makes this case extraordinary isn't the celebrity involved. It's the sheer volume of eyewitness accounts from servants, physicians, and companions who recorded everything. We have day-by-day observations of how a human being processes the systematic shutdown of their own body. From July 1820, Napoleon experienced what modern physicians recognize as the classic progression of gastric cancer: severe stomach pains, nausea, and persistent vomiting. His doctors at the time, Francesco Antomarchi and Archibald Arnott, documented symptoms but lacked the medical framework to understand them. Gastric cancer wasn't even properly differentiated from ulcers until Cuvillier's anatomical work in 1835, 14 years after Napoleon's death. This meant Napoleon was being treated by physicians who genuinely couldn't comprehend what was destroying him. Consider the psychological impact of this situation. Here was a man who had commanded armies across Europe, who had redesigned the legal systems of nations, who had made decisions affecting millions of lives. Now he was at the mercy of doctors who had no accurate diagnosis, no effective treatment, and no honest prognosis to offer. The first stage of psychological collapse often involves recognizing that the experts you've relied on have no real answers. Napoleon clung to patterns. By March 1821, he was confined to bed, but his companions noted something remarkable in his behavior. He continued dictating, continued planning, continued acting as though his situation were temporary rather than terminal. This isn't denial in the simplistic sense. Research into chronic illness shows this is the mind's protective mechanism, the shifting between what psychologist Kathy Chalmers called foregrounding illness and foregrounding wellness. Napoleon would spend hours dictating his memoirs and his will, then collapse into episodes where his body made its deterioration impossible to ignore. One detail from the historical record deserves more attention than it typically receives. Napoleon's obsession with hot baths during his final weeks represents something profound about how humans cope with physical suffering. His valet documented that the former emperor would spend 2 to 3 hours in a copper bathtub, adding scalding water whenever the temperature dropped, even as his skin turned red and began to peel. This behavior appears irrational from the outside, but understood through the lens of chronic pain management, it makes perfect sense. Heat application remains one of the oldest and most instinctive responses to abdominal distress. Napoleon had discovered, probably through trial and error, that water hot enough to cause superficial skin damage was the only thing that quieted the constant fire in his gut. He was, in effect, practicing a primitive form of counter-stimulation therapy, using controlled external pain to override uncontrollable internal agony. The bath served another purpose. It was the one environment where Napoleon could still exercise control. The water temperature, the duration, the solitude. In a world where his body had become a prison, the bathtub became his last domain. Psychological research consistently shows that maintaining some sense of agency, however small, is critical to psychological survival during illness. Napoleon's baths weren't about hygiene. They were about identity. What's particularly fascinating is how this connects to broader patterns of coping. When illness strips away the larger structures of identity, whether career, physical capability, or social role, people universally seek smaller domains of control. Some become meticulous about their medications. Others reorganize their living spaces obsessively. Napoleon chose his bathtub. The water represented perhaps the last boundary he could establish between himself and his failing body. Understanding what 19th century medicine actually did to Napoleon provides crucial context for his psychological state. On May 3rd, 1821, just 2 days before his death, his physicians administered calomel, also known as mercurous chloride. This wasn't malpractice by their standards. Mercury compounds were considered legitimate medicine for almost everything, from constipation to syphilis to melancholy. Patients who consumed mercury suffered what contemporary witnesses described as violent purging, cramping, diarrhea, vomiting, and excessive salivation. These effects were considered evidence that the treatment was working, that the body was expelling whatever harmful substances had accumulated. In reality, they were symptoms of poisoning being added to whatever underlying condition already existed. Napoleon, already weakened by advanced gastric cancer with likely perforation of the stomach wall, received doses of mercury that triggered catastrophic gastrointestinal reactions. The historical accounts describe black, tarry stools, which modern medicine recognizes as melena, the distinctive sign of upper gastrointestinal bleeding. The mercury didn't cause his cancer, but the subsequent hemorrhaging it triggered may have accelerated his death by days or even weeks. What makes this medically significant is the psychological dimension. Napoleon knew the treatments weren't helping. He retained enough mental clarity to recognize that each intervention left him weaker than before. Yet he had no alternative framework for understanding his condition. He couldn't refuse treatment without acknowledging that nothing could save him. So he submitted to procedures that amounted to torture, because accepting torture meant maintaining hope that treatment was possible. This pattern echoes through modern end-of-life medicine in ways that should make us uncomfortable. How often do patients accept aggressive interventions not because they believe they'll work, but because refusing them means acknowledging that the situation is terminal? Napoleon's submission to mercury purges wasn't ignorance. It was the desperate mathematics of hope, where any chance, even a terrible one, feels preferable to certainty. In his final days, Napoleon experienced episodes that observers described as vivid hallucinations. He would cry out about cavalry charges, positioning invisible troops, calling for officers who had been dead for years. He demanded updates on Josephine, his first wife, who had died 7 years earlier. He seemed to be reliving the Egyptian campaign from 2 decades past. From a neurological perspective, this represents terminal delirium, a common feature of the dying process when the brain, deprived of adequate oxygen and flooded with metabolic waste products, begins generating its own sensory experiences. But purely medical explanations miss something important about what Napoleon's deliriums reveal. He wasn't hallucinating randomly. His dying brain returned repeatedly to specific themes: his armies, his campaigns, his former wife. Even in delirium, the architecture of identity persists. The questions Napoleon's hallucinations kept asking were the questions that had defined his life. Where are my soldiers? What is the tactical situation? These weren't the confused ramblings of a failing mind. They were a mind failing while still organized around its deepest values. Research into end-of-life experiences shows this pattern consistently. People in terminal delirium often speak to deceased family members, return to pivotal moments in their lives, or express concerns that reflect their lifelong priorities. Napoleon didn't hallucinate about random subjects. He hallucinated about the things that had made him Napoleon. His identity, even as it disintegrated, remained coherent to its last fragments. This offers something valuable for anyone who will accompany a loved one through terminal illness. Delirium isn't the erasure of the person you knew. It's the person you knew expressed through a damaged medium. The grandfather who keeps asking about a long-sold business isn't confused about current reality. He's revealing what that business meant to his sense of self. The mother who calls out for her own mother isn't regressing. She's expressing a relationship that shaped everything she became. The autopsy performed on May 6, 1821, revealed the full extent of Napoleon's disease. An international team of modern gastrointestinal pathologists who reviewed the original reports in 2021 concluded that Napoleon died of advanced malignant gastric neoplasia, stomach cancer that had grown to massive proportions. The tumor had essentially replaced much of his stomach, measuring approximately 10 centimeters in length. There was perforation near the pylorus, the outlet of the stomach, though Napoleon survived this perforation because the tumor had adhered to his liver, creating an accidental seal that prevented stomach contents from spilling into his abdominal cavity. The original autopsy doctors also noted metastases, small white nodules scattered throughout his intestines, indicating the cancer had begun spreading to other organs. What makes these findings psychologically significant is the timeline they imply. This level of cancer development doesn't happen overnight. Napoleon had been carrying this disease for months, possibly years, while still making plans, still hoping to escape his exile, still imagining a political future. Every dictated memoir, every complaint to the British authorities about his treatment, every scheme to leave Saint Helena was undertaken by a man whose body was already hosting a lethal passenger. This disconnect between subjective experience and objective reality deserves reflection. Napoleon felt increasingly unwell, certainly, but there's no evidence he understood that he was dying until very late in the process. The human capacity to remain future-oriented even while the future is being eliminated is both remarkable and unsettling. We plan, we hope, We imagine ourselves into scenarios that our bodies may already be making impossible. The historical accounts of Napoleon's final weeks contain details that most popular histories omit because they're too disturbing for general consumption. The loss of bowel control, the inability to stand without assistance, the necessity of being physically restrained when delirium made him combative, the smells that forced his servants to burn sulfur, trying to mask the evidence of bodily breakdown. These details matter because they illuminate the fundamental tension between identity and physical reality. Napoleon was still the emperor to his companions. They still addressed him with proper titles, maintained court protocols, sought his decisions on matters large and small. But his body had become something his former self would have found intolerable. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of terminal illness for observers. The person you knew exists simultaneously with a body that seems to belong to someone else entirely. The sharp mind and the soiled bedsheets, the clear memories and the inability to swallow water, the will that could once mobilize nations and the legs that can no longer support standing upright. Napoleon's companions faced a question that every family facing terminal illness eventually confronts. Which version is the true one? Is Napoleon the figure dictating his will with military precision, or the man being held down by 4 servants while he fights to review imaginary troops? The answer, of course, is both. But holding both versions in mind simultaneously requires a kind of psychological flexibility that nothing prepares us for. Napoleon's case is extreme in its historical significance, but entirely typical in its medical and psychological patterns. Advanced gastric cancer, the kind that killed him, still follows remarkably similar courses today, despite all our medical advances. The weight loss, the persistent nausea, the characteristic coffee ground vomiting that indicates gastrointestinal bleeding, the gradual transition from ambulatory to bedridden, the terminal delirium. These elements would be recognizable to any modern oncologist. What has changed is our capacity to name what's happening and, to some extent, to manage symptoms. Napoleon's doctors achieved neither because they lacked the diagnostic frameworks that didn't exist yet. Autopsy performed the autopsy and accurately described what he found. But he was working 14 years before anyone published clear distinctions between benign and malignant gastric conditions. He was literally doing science before the science existed. The psychological lessons, however, transfer across centuries. Human beings facing terminal illness go through recognizable stages, not the simplified Kubler-Ross stages that get taught in introductory psychology, but more complex patterns of engagement and withdrawal, hope and despair, agency and surrender. Napoleon, for all his historical uniqueness, experienced these patterns exactly as countless anonymous people experience them today. There's a strange coda to Napoleon's story that raises questions medical science still can't fully answer. When his body was exhumed in 1840, 19 years after burial, observers reported something apparently impossible. Napoleon was remarkably preserved. His features were recognizable. His uniform remained intact. He looked, according to witnesses, as though he'd been buried recently, rather than 2 decades earlier. Various explanations have been proposed. The arsenic in his system, absorbed either from contaminated wallpaper at Longwood House or from chronic exposure over years, may have acted as a preservative. The airtight nature of his multiple coffins may have prevented decomposition. Secret embalming may have been performed. The truth is probably some combination of factors, but certainty remains elusive. What matters philosophically is what this preservation represents. Napoleon spent his final weeks watching his body betray him in the most fundamental ways possible. The strength that had positioned artillery under enemy fire, the stamina that had ridden through Russian winters, the iron constitution that had survived assassination attempts and battlefield injuries, all of it dissolved into helplessness and indignity. And then, impossibly, that same body refused to disappear. It persisted, preserved against all expectation, as if insisting on its own reality, even after the person it carried had departed. The body that Napoleon had lost control of in life refused to follow the expected patterns even in death. What can anyone take from Napoleon's final days? The question seems almost presumptuous, drawing practical lessons from the death of someone so historically remote. But the medical and psychological realities transcend historical distance. First, the importance of honest communication about prognosis. Napoleon's doctors couldn't tell him what was killing him because they didn't know. Modern medicine usually knows, but often communicates poorly or not at all. Patients and families deserve accurate information, even when that information is devastating, because accurate information allows for meaningful choices about how remaining time is spent. Second, the centrality of small comforts. Napoleon's hot baths weren't medically indicated. They were psychologically essential. When treating terminal illness, the interventions that matter most to patients are often not the ones that appear in medical textbooks. Finding what brings comfort, even temporary comfort, even comfort that seems irrational, may be more valuable than any aggressive treatment. Third, the persistence of identity through physical collapse. Napoleon remained Napoleon even as his body failed. His values, his preoccupations, his fundamental character expressed themselves through whatever medium remained available, including delirium. This should reassure anyone who fears that terminal illness erases the person they love. It doesn't. It expresses that person through increasingly constrained channels, but the person persists. Most people will not die as Napoleon did, exiled on a remote island with their medical care determined by political enemies. But the fundamental experience, watching your body become unreliable, depending on others for basic needs, recognizing that your future has contracted to weeks or days, these elements await anyone who lives long enough. We avoid thinking about this because thinking about it is uncomfortable. But avoidance carries costs. Families who have never discussed end-of-life preferences find themselves making agonizing decisions without guidance. Patients who have never contemplated their own mortality face it unprepared when the diagnosis arrives. Medical systems designed around cure rather than comfort fail people whose conditions have moved beyond curing. Napoleon, for all his faults, faced his death with remarkable clarity once he accepted it was coming. He dictated his will with the same precision he had applied to military campaigns. He arranged his affairs. He said what he wanted said. He retained agency over meaning even when agency over his body had vanished. This is perhaps the real lesson. Not that death can be avoided or even truly prepared for, but that how we approach death reveals and expresses who we are. Napoleon died as he had lived, focused on France, on glory, on the army he had built, and the son he barely knew. His final words, disputed among witnesses, all clustered around the same themes: France, his son, his soldiers. We've covered substantial ground today, from the medical specifics of gastric cancer in the 19th century to the psychological patterns that transcend any particular era. Napoleon's final weeks were horrifying by any standard. The combination of untreatable disease and actively harmful medical interventions created suffering that would be considered unconscionable today. But within that suffering, something recognizably human persisted. Napoleon coped through control where he could find it, through returning to memories of his greatest achievements, through maintaining his sense of identity against overwhelming physical dissolution. These coping mechanisms weren't unique to him. They appear in terminal illness across cultures and centuries because they express something fundamental about how human consciousness processes its own extinction. The next time you find yourself with someone facing serious illness, whether a diagnosis just received or a condition progressing toward its conclusion, remember what Napoleon's case teaches. The person is still there, even when the body has become unfamiliar. Small comforts matter more than grand interventions. Honest information enables meaningful choices. An identity persists through the filters of pain and delirium and physical failure, expressing itself in whatever channels remain available. Napoleon conquered nations. He redesigned legal systems that still influence modern law. He remains one of the most studied figures in human history. And in the end, he died like everyone dies, struggling against a body that had ceased to cooperate, calling out for the things and people that had given his life meaning. There's something both humbling and reassuring in that universality. The emperor who made Europe tremble died trembling himself, not from fear, but from the final vulnerability that comes for all of us. Understanding that vulnerability, really understanding it, may be the only preparation that actually matters. Thanks for watching. If you found value in this video, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want to see more, check out this video right here. See you in the next one.